Hello and welcome to our today's interaction with Dr. Michael Rubin. Before I introduce the speaker, we just have a few announcements. So today it's unlike our previous webinars where we have a more formal session with three or four speakers. Today it's more of an informal interaction with Dr. Michael Rubin. We'll be covering a range of issues pertaining to Middle East, South Asia, Afghanistan, and other aspects of the Indo-US foreign policy. In our today's event, NewsX channel is our partner, and this recording will be telecasted on the NewsX channel. We'll decide the time and we'll let you know once the time is decided. And for the bandwidth issue, I would request that except the active speakers, there are the other participants to turn off their videos. Sometimes, because of the bad connection, internet problems, the bandwidth issues are there. So I'll just begin with the introduction of Dr. Michael Rubin. Dr. Michael Rubin is he's resident scholar with American Enterprise Institute, and he worked as former staff advisor to the Secretary of Defense and political advisor to the Provisional Government of Iraq. He has authored Into the Shadows, Radical Vigilantes in Khatmi's Iran, and Dancing with the Devil, Perils of Engaging Rogue Regime. So, Dr. Rubin, welcome to our today's event. And
Thank you.
Yes. We have it's more of an informal interaction, but so I'll just read out a few questions, but feel free to discuss from your point of view, and you can just be more widespread, like in covering the issues. First is, do you see Biden returning to Obama's policy with Iran at the expense of the Gulf states, and how do you see this vis-a-vis Saudi ties with Israel? Second is, if you could pick two or three allies in the West Asia, who would they be, and how will they advance U.S. interests in the region? So, given the strong trend towards the bipolarization of world politics, how likely do you see the U.S. military disengagement in the Middle East and Gulf, given how China is consolidating its presence in the region? More fundamentally, does the U.S. presence hurt or advance U.S. interests? And our last question, how does US sees India's role in Afghanistan and West Asia, in particular in Afghanistan after the US withdrawal? We'll have
thank you very much, and thanks to the Usanis Foundation. With regard to the first question, let me just jump right in. Do you see Biden returning to the Obama policy with Iran at the expense of the Gulf states? And how do you see this vis-a-vis Saudi relations with Israel? There's a lot packed into that question, but the short answer is yes. The difference between the Obama administration and the Biden administration is that the Obama administration didn't try to hide what it was doing. The Biden administration is much better at holding meetings with Israelis, holding meetings with Saudis, holding meetings with congressional Republicans, but then not listening to them. So they can talk about how they're consulting with all their partners, but behind the scenes, for example, we see that the Biden administration is pressuring or has pressured South Korea to release $1 billion in aid. We see that the Biden administration, Brett McGurk and Rob Malley specifically, are pressuring the Iraqi government to release $4 billion from the escrow account, which was established during the Trump administration so that Iraq could purchase gas from Iran without actually having to pay money to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That is getting liquefied, and it's just a matter of time. We see increasingly the fact that the metrics which the Biden administration are talking about vis-a-vis Iran are changing. So, for example, whereas initially the Biden administration talked about compliance for compliance, that has slowly evolved to be, we will unravel our sanctions, we will lift our sanctions if Iran pledges to come back into compliance, which again is a very, very different standard. Now, the biggest change as it relates to India when it comes to Iran would probably be a loosening of American restrictions and concerns over use of the Chabahar port. This is especially going to be true once the United States withdraws from Afghanistan. We're no longer going to need to rely on Pakistan logistically, nor frankly are we going to want to rely on Pakistan logistically. And that opens a lot of avenues for Chabahar to move forward. Now, when India has dealt with Chabahar before, part of the problem wasn't simply the United States diplomatic pressure not to do it, but part of the problem also was the Iranians. It can be very difficult to deal with them commercially. India has understood this. China increasingly at Chabahar understands this. But it's one of those issues which I would certainly watch as an Iran watcher. When it comes to the Gulf states, look, the Gulf states are very angry right now. The United Arab Emirates is angry, even if they're starting to make accommodations with Iran. The Saudis are furious. The Israelis are furious because the meetings which they've had in Washington haven't gone well. Biden simply wants to say he's met, but he doesn't actually want to make any concessions or fill any loopholes. And this will be dangerous in the long term because we're going to have a situation with any renewed Iranian nuclear deal in which it's going to be tied solely to the Biden administration. Then we might have a repeat in the future where a future administration is simply going to pick up and walk away from it. Unless it is Senate ratified as a treaty, it's not going to have staying power in the United States. And that is just a very, very dangerous dynamic, which does tremendous reputational damage to the United States as well. And as you imply, it's also going to drive Saudi Arabia closer to Israel. And the other issue, which is going to, it's going to cause, is it's going to lead to many pivotal Middle Eastern states to try to develop their own nuclear weapons, whether it's an indigenous program or whether it's an off-the-shelf purchase. So I could imagine a decade from now that not only Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but perhaps Egypt and Turkey as well, are all going to have active, if undeclared, nuclear weapons programs. Your second question was if you could pick 2 or 3 allies of the United States in the Middle East as the situation currently stands, who would they be? And how will they advance American interests in the region? You know, this is a really, really key question. And it's an incredibly difficult question to answer simply because so many traditional allies of the United States feel betrayed by the current shift within the United States toward Iran. Certainly, Israel will remain a key partner, and Israel has enough, if you will, support within Congress and the broader public within the United States that it feels it can outlast any extreme positions on the part of the Biden administration. And even within the Biden administration, someone like Tony Blinken, someone like Jake Sullivan do have much better working relationships with Israel than someone like John Kerry has in the past, or Susan Rice. So certainly Israel would be one. In the past, any American would have said the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, but I don't think we can any longer say this. Certainly, they are going to do what's best for them, and if it means greater outreach to China in the future, so be it. Turkey, of course, isn't really an ally. If we look at the metric of how many congressmen are in the Congressional Turkey Caucus, that number has gone from just below 200 to just about 76. So they've lost half their support over the last couple years. The Armenian caucus, the Hellenic caucus are both bigger in Washington today than the Turkey caucus. Besides Israel, the only other country I can really say that would be a key American ally would be Bahrain. And the reason for that is simply because Bahrain hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet. The Democrats have tempered down their criticism of Bahraini human rights, especially now that it's been more than 10 years since the Pearl Monument uprising, and Bahrain simply seems to have its house in order. Oman has decent relations with the United States, certainly Morocco does, but I would keep an eye on Morocco. Morocco, of course, was the first country in the world to recognize American independence. It hosts the oldest American, continually operating American diplomatic mission in Tangiers. And Morocco is incredibly tight, and so it is significant that the Biden administration has said that they are going to continue with the Trump administration's decision to recognize the Western Sahara as part of Morocco. There is a lot of fear in Morocco because they very much dislike the Obama administration. They very much dislike specifically Susan Rice, who they saw as partisan to the Polisario Front. Biden has simply shut down that debate and embraced Morocco. So the short answer would be Israel, Bahrain, and Morocco. But absent from that list are Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. And given the strong currents toward a bipolarization of world politics, how do you see the U.S. military disengagement in the Middle East and Gulf, given how China is consolidating its presence in the region? I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And my critics would say I only get that right half the time. But the reason why I studied history, as opposed to political science, is because I believe it's important to understand societies from a bottom-up level and understand that each society is culturally and historically unique. And your recent article in the National Security website in the United States in 1945 hit the nail on the head because it really taught Americans how, Abhinav, how to understand India as we move towards the Quad. And so I would commend to everyone that you look at that article, which presumably is in Usanis Foundation website as well. But when I look at the Persian Gulf states, what I see is what I am reminded of is 1968, when I think it was Sir Anthony Eden who gave the East of Suez speech, that the British would no longer project power east of the Suez Canal. And this came against the backdrop of the devaluation of the pound sterling and a basic economic crisis inside the United Kingdom. So as the United Kingdom withdrew back, starting in 1968, finishing in 1970, that's when the United States actually came in and took possession of a lot of the former British military bases. The point of this is, when at first President Obama, or now President Biden, talks about a pivot to Asia, what many of the Gulf states hear is a pivot away from us. And so they look at this through the lens of what happened 50 years ago, and they interpret this as needing to make accommodations with another power. And if that power is China, so be it. That doesn't mean that they're going to tie themselves to China the same way that the United States does. The same way that the Gulf tied itself to the United States. But they are going to ensure that not all their eggs are in one basket. Now, when it comes to China's military prowess, as someone who has also had an affiliation with the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and as someone who teaches on aircraft carriers in amphibious ready groups, one of the issues which I always use as a metric to determine Chinese influence is and Chinese military capability in the region isn't their diplomatic statements, but rather it's their ability to carry out NEO operations, non-combatant evacuation operations. For example, such as they supposedly did in Libya when the Libyan civil war started. And the reason for that is if you are able to logistically coordinate your Navy in order to evacuate your citizens, that shows tremendous logistical abilities, a tremendous ability to rally in terms in time of danger, and ability to coordinate with helicopters, with Marines and so forth to get people from the ground onto the ships. And what I saw with regard to Libya is that the Chinese talked about doing this, but on the ground there wasn't much evidence that they actually did. A lot of Chinese were left behind at the height of this operation. And so despite the extension of the Djibouti base that the Chinese have, I'm not sure that the Chinese really have some of the abilities they talk about. One other military aspect about China, and this is something to which I would commend the work of my American Enterprise Institute colleague, Nicholas Eberstadt, who's a demographer. China, as you know, is facing a demographic precipice because of 30 some odd years of the one-child policy. And because of the one-child policy, you also had femicide in China, in which many Chinese girls were killed at birth. And therefore, you have a distortion within China about the number of males versus the number of females. The point of this is China has never really fought a serious war at a time when every male soldier came from a household in which they were the only son and likelihood the only child. And so this creates a dynamic which hasn't really been explored about the domestic ramifications of China's warfighting capabilities. The reason I bring this up is it does impact analysis and estimates behind the scenes. We can look at Xi's rhetoric on one hand, but the actual willingness of Chinese families to allow their only sons to die in combat is a very different thing which hasn't been explored and which could have some domestic ramifications in China. But I'm going a little bit further afield from the question. The other issue, just with regard to the United States, is as Eastern Mediterranean gas has developed, we have a lot less interest in Persian Gulf gas and oil. At the same time, sorry, one last point. The United States, if you ask any admiral, any retired admiral, American admiral, what military posture should we have to make the Iranians take us seriously during diplomacy? To a man or a woman, they say that what we need to do is remove our aircraft carriers from the Persian Gulf. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, historically, we never had aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. Until 1991, we didn't have them there. From 1991 until 2003, on average, we had one carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf. From 2003 to 2011, on average, we had two. And remember, today, the United States only has 11 aircraft carriers, half of which have to be in dry dock or undergoing major repairs at any given time simply because of the wear and tear. So having two aircraft carriers there is distortive to American strategy. But the broader problem is to launch an aircraft off a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier takes 26 knots of wind speed. To do that, you either have to speed up or turn into the wind. But because the Persian Gulf is so narrow, with all the various islands, Abu Musa, the Greater and Lesser Tumba Islands, Farsi Island, and so forth, and because it's so shallow, never more than 100 meters, it basically means that our aircraft carriers don't have the ability to maneuver in order to launch aircraft without violating Iranian territorial waters. At the same time, they're vulnerable to all the Iranian small boats. But if we remove them from the Persian Gulf, let's say 600 kilometers out into the northern Indian Ocean, then we could strike at Iran. Iran couldn't hit us, which is why that posture is something which the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would stand up and notice. So the reason why we don't do that is, again, going back to Sir Anthony Eden in 1968 and the East of Suez speech and the British withdrawal. I mean, what you end up having is end up having is the fact that psychologically the Americans are dependent. Now, psychologically they are dependent on the Americans. And then what role does the U.S. envision for India in the Afghan peace process? This is the hugely important question. And the important thing here is that look, Zalmay Khalilzad treated India poorly, treated India like dirt. If the United States is going to make a political decision to leave Afghanistan, we should have just left Afghanistan. We shouldn't have hobbled. We shouldn't have kneecapped. We shouldn't have crippled the Afghan government on the way out. The time to get India on board was at the very beginning of these negotiations, rather than simply leaving a mess and expecting India to fill the vacuum. I do hope that India will help the Afghan government, but I'm just embarrassed at how poorly we handled what I see as our key ally in South Asia, which is India. And so that's my answer.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you. So I'll just, begin some of my observations and would request you to share your thoughts on them. starting from this Afghan peace process, like as we see, it's more or less clear that once the Americans withdraw, Taliban is going to come back, and the Taliban safe havens are very intact in Pakistan. In Pakistan, if you see lately, or like this whole process of Islamic extremism and radicalization is just progressing by leaps and bounds. Now you have organizations even threatening the government to expel the proper ambassadors and all. So in such a case, I mean, I see that in Afghanistan there's this kind of an emergence of a new great game where you have non-state actors and state actors. Among non-state actors, all the terrorist organizations, including Taliban, ISKP, and some of the Pakistan's Kashmir-centric organizations like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, they will also shift their training camps to Afghanistan. That is one ecosystem. Then I also see Turkey coming up as a major force in Afghanistan because Turkey's Sadat has very deep-rooted ties with Pakistan's deep state ISI, and Sadat may train Taliban in Afghanistan, and Turkey's ties with Pakistan are very strong, so they may facilitate their entrenchment in Afghanistan. Then we have Russians and Chinese interest in Afghanistan hardly needs any elaboration. Recently, there was a whole spy ring of Chinese caught in Afghanistan. So how do you look at that? Is this, I mean, American withdrawal from this region? I mean, this is some kind of giving out your space, your power, whatever leverage and whatever investment you made, completely to a set of rogue powers. And in such a situation, India will be completely powerless because we made investments in humanitarian developments, in the welfare work, and the powers which will be militarily powerful in Afghanistan now. I mean, we don't have good ties or good equations with them. So, how do you look at this?
Look, I largely agree with you. Frankly, I think when this is all over, that India should declare Zalmay Khalilzad persona non grata for the damage he has done. But where I see Afghanistan going is I share your concern with regard to the non-state actors and the terrorist groups, which you've just said, and I share your assessment that they're going to likely move their training camps into Afghanistan. It's absolute nonsense to say that even during the terms of the February 29th agreement, that the Taliban had disassociated itself from al-Qaeda or terrorists. I mean, we've seen repeatedly, for example, al-Qaeda in the India subcontinent fighters and leaders who have been killed inside Afghanistan, which just belies the notion that the Taliban have kept their agreement. What I ultimately see happening is all the neighboring states are going to support their own proxy militias in order to create buffers, sort of like during the 1990s, where you had Dostam, who was supported by the Uzbeks and the Turks. Yes. You had Ismail Khan in Herat, and so forth. We're going to have that dynamic again. If we go back to history in the Soviet period, Najibullah had survived for 3 years because the money kept flowing. At least he was able to control Kabul. When the Americans withdraw, the question is, how long will it take before the American Congress, which tends to be much more inwardly focused, simply cuts off the money, figuring that they want to build a bridge in Iowa somewhere without recognizing the strategic implications, not only of what this means for the United States, but also what this will mean for our allies in the region.
Thank you.
I agree with you on Turkey separately.
Thank you. I'll come back to Turkey just after one more question. So regarding Iran, somehow, I feel that during the Trump administration, Trump had a very, very strong and a firm approach in dealing with Iran. And Qasem Soleimani was killed, and I sense that because of Trump's firm and a very principled approach, opposition to Iran, even the other countries were very hesitant in approaching or like making deals with Iran. But after Biden administration came in, so they gave a signal of going back to the deal and just going a little relaxed. So that kind of inspired or motivated China to get pally with Iranians, and now they have signed this 300 or 400 billion dollar deal for like next 25 years. And given like having seen the Chinese penetration into a country's systems, like the way they have penetrated in Pakistan's economic system, social system, they are going to get into Iran very badly. So, I mean, don't you think that this America is giving very negative signals, and because of this negative signaling, even the Saudis will move, I mean, they will stop trusting Americans and they would move towards China or some alternate powers?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, again, I'm not a diplomat. It frustrates the heck out of me, but your analysis is right. you've got a situation where, look, we can talk about this 25-year China-Iran deal. And I'm not sure there's as much there as some people say. Neither the Chinese nor the Iranians have actually released a final draft of the agreements and so forth. But I do think it's significant that the Chinese only agreed to only formalize this deal once Trump was out of office, and they saw that they would have no consequences for doing so from the United States. That said, many Chinese businesses are still a little bit hesitant because it's difficult to deal with Khatam al-Anbiya and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they also do know that after 4 years, if there's a different administration, the new American administration might turn around and sanction anyone who's doing business with Iran. That's also something which India needs to be concerned about, simply because unless this is enshrined as a treaty in the United States, it's easy just to dispense with, as Trump did, and the stigma from dispensing with this sort of thing is going to be less every time it's done. But when it comes to this problem, you're absolutely right on this, and I'm not sure what more can be done other than note that that the sanctions and the willingness of the Americans to stand by deals is notoriously short at this point.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Dr. So, I just see that Ambassador Trigunayat and Ambassador Pandey have also joined. Ambassador Trigunayat has served in the Middle East for long. He often writes commentaries on things happening in the Middle East. And Ambassador Pandey served in Central Asian countries, so they are very familiar, or in fact, I would say, they can relate to the developments and the discussions which is going on right now. Okay, we'll have them discussing some of the key issues later. So, one more thing which you discussed in the beginning that, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. In the beginning, that you see that in the Middle Eastern this scenario, many more countries would come up with their own nuclear bombs, dirty or purified or whatever, some kind of nuclear capabilities. But I mean, personally, I sense that when we are talking about West Asia, we are dealing with multiple entities. As when we say that, I mean, when we say that we are dealing with Pakistan, we say that we are dealing with multiple layers of governance systems. We have a government formal, then we have terrorist organizations, then we have a deep state, then we have Islamist organizations. I guess, I mean, this is, if not entirely, then to an extent, is quite relevant for the Middle Eastern countries also, right? They have these Islamist organizations, terrorist organizations, running a parallel authority to the governments, very actively working. Do you see the threat of these, dirty nuclear bombs, just finally ending up with these terrorist organizations? And if that happens, then that raises this, threat to humanity and even to the U.S. interest a lot more. How do you look at that?
Well, of course, that's a nightmare scenario. And that's why within the United States, the major concern that the United States has vis-a-vis Pakistan is the complete collapse of Pakistan, given the loose nukes problem. And yes, I know the history. The Eisenhower administration certainly helped Pakistan get its program started. I'm not here simply to argue about history because, I mean, it's not productive, but that ultimately is the major concern of the United States. That said, it's been pretty public that the United States does have scenarios in which we try to secure any nuclear material should Pakistan collapse. But ultimately, the longer, let me put it this way, the United States is simply lucky that we haven't faced this problem yet, and we can't count our blessings and assume that we are never going to face a loose nukes or a radiological bomb problem. It's very possible, and this is one of the things that frustrates me about the debate with regard to Iran is everyone argues, oh, well, an Iranian nuclear weapon would have 20 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and then a competent, precise delivery system. But that's only if you want to get to the 100% solution. You can ultimately get to another solution and perhaps even have more plausible deniability if you do go the dirty bomb route.
Thank you. So these are very relevant threats, and I mean, that kind of scares us because for us, it has always been a worry that Pakistani nukes may fall up, may end up with some of these terrorist organizations someday. So that's why I just brought up this issue. Now, I'll just come back to one of my favorite, or rather, a topic which interests many: the issue of Turkey. Until recently, not long, but I guess before India abrogated Article 370, most of us in India believe that Turkey is a Kemalist Turkey, and following the most almost on the verge of its Europeanization. But then, after the Article 370, Turkey bitterly opposed India's stance in the various multilateral platforms, and then many organizations here started studying Turkey, and then finally they came face to face with the reality that Turkey is going in an entirely different track. So just coming to that, I mean, how do you look at this or this new restructuring of the political equations in the Middle East? This new alliance of Turkey, Iran, Qatar. This is coming up very strongly. And by the way, Saudis, which were one of the biggest funders of Wahhabi organizations in India and enjoyed paramount reputation in Kashmir and among the Muslims of India, they are losing out very badly. They are hated in Kashmir now. So how do you look at this emergence of Turkey as a leader of Ummah, the global caliphate?
I mean, ultimately, Turkey is in the 21st century what Saudi Arabia was in the 20th century. And unfortunately, too many diplomats are apologetic to Turkey and therefore willing to pretend that they're dealing with the Turkey of 25 years ago rather than the Turkey of today. And the ramifications are going to be as great as when the United States and the West ignored Saudi Arabia back in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Saudi Arabia changed posture not after 9/11, but when they faced their own domestic problem, when they faced their own blowback with the compound bombings and so forth. Basically, this is a major problem. The United States needs to wake up to it. Frankly, other countries need to as well. Within Africa, what Turkey is doing is scary. And one of the things that most disappointed me with the Biden administration with Zalmay Khalilzad is that they were willing to allow Turkey to have this disproportionate influence in Afghanistan after the American withdrawal. I've walked around Kabul. I mean, I go to Afghanistan from time to time. I'm not in a diplomatic or military compound. And what I see the Turks doing outside the wire versus what they're doing inside the wire, it's night and day.
Thank you. So Turkey, I mean, this is going to be a little more problematic for quite some time in the future. That's what I mean. Agree? Hello.
What? Yeah, Turkey's going to be a huge problem in the future.
And recently, Biden government gave its decision to recognize the Armenian genocide, and we have come across some very bitter statements from Turkey against this. I mean, this is very surprising. I mean, I would say, I wouldn't say surprising, but how come this Armenian lobby has come up very strongly in Washington D.C. and was able to mobilize so much?
Well, I mean, they've been able to mobilize so much, less because the Armenian lobby is all that great. It's just that Turkey has done such a poor job. Like I said earlier, the number of congressmen willing to sign up to the Turkey caucus has plummeted. It's less than half of what it used to be. And the major argument in Washington for refusing to recognize the Armenian genocide is we need Turkey. Turkey's a partner, but Turkey under Erdogan has shown that it's not a partner. And remember that the Turkish and Azeri invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh was actually on the 100th anniversary of the Ottoman invasion of independent Armenia. That symbolism has raised a lot of concerns that what the Turks and the Azeris mean to do is actually continue genocide, that it's not just a historic matter.
Yes. And even because this Turkish war in Armenia, the recent war in Armenia, it has made some issues here also in India, because we are also worried that they might supply some of their new high quality drones to the terrorist organizations working in Kashmir, and that can give another added headache to the Indian security forces. So that's going to be a big problem.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about Turkey, and I know that you yourself had a great article in the National Interest
Yes.
which is one of the most influential American national security magazines, talking about this. That Turkey really, I mean, the United States needs to pay attention that Turkey is becoming a global Islamist threat.
Thank you so much. And interestingly, Turkey is dealing with multiple, it's dealing at multiple levels and with multiple entities. So in India's case, if you see, on one hand, they are dealing with the terrorist organizations, like proper terrorist organizations. You have Lashkar, Jaish-e-Mohammed, all these, the ISKB. At the same time, they're dealing with Islamist organizations like Jamaat-e-Islami, Popular Front of India. These organizations, they are not overtly indulging in violence, but they are following a very, I would say, unique identity politics, which is based on the concepts of Islamism, and they want to bring Sharia rule. And they are providing logistical support to the terrorist organizations, facilitating and creating a ground for them. At the third level, they are dealing with the youngsters in Kashmir and among the Muslims in India, and they are trying to lure them using the notions like the human rights violations. And these notions are specifically meant for those youngsters who are not very religious. So giving them false and fabricated narratives that India is not a safe country for you. Here you are a minority, you are being suppressed. Entirely false and completely fabricated. We are a secular country. We have these various kinds of minorities living in India. Jewish community never faced any discrimination in India. But the way Turkey is acting, at multiple levels, creating an information warfare, narrative warfare, and reaching out to the terrorist organization, that is going to be a big headache for India as well. And they are also having link-ups with the Islamist organization based in US, like this World Assembly of Muslim Youth, Islamic Circle of North America, Muslim American Society. And I guess the US should really be careful, because some of these big Islamist groups are very powerful with the DC, like senators and Congress members. And through them, Turkey can really influence them. I mean, this is just an observation. Now I'll be moving into some other area, like, I mean, although your expertise lies in the West Asia, but we are very interested in the way America is dealing with Russia these days, because we realize that Quad is coming up as a major, geopolitical game changer, and now it's a consensus that China is presenting a major threat to this entire civilization. It's an existential threat. So, in such a circumstance, do you think it's a rational choice to focus your efforts on Russia and creating a situation where you are cornering Russia, you're compelling them to move into the Chinese fold?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Russia is an increasingly large problem. I don't think that the United States needs to take an either-or approach. I mean, certainly, I think we need to have Europe understand the difficulties which both countries pose in the region. I'm very, very disappointed, for example, with Europe and especially with Germany with regard to the Nord Stream 2. At the very least, we shouldn't be becoming more dependent on Russia, nor should our allies becoming more dependent on Russia. India is a different situation. Traditionally, India's military has been much closer to the Russians, and it's understandable that India doesn't need to pick or choose in this region quite as much. It should have a cooperative relationship with both. But that said, from a U.S. standpoint, we need to be wary of both parties, both China and Russia. I think it's much fairer, for example, for the United States to pressure Cyprus to not work with the Russians than it is to pressure India to the same extent.
No, I certainly agree, but I feel that, like, in my conversation with many diplomats who served in Russia and some of the Indian Russia experts also, I just found that Russians have their own internal issues with China, and they would never want to play second fiddle to China. And this is what they hate, kind of. I mean, the way China is trying to dominating Central Asia, just getting into the Russian space. So I think this is an area where actually America can use India, and its good ties with Russia, just to manage Russia for the time being, and at least for now, because now we feel that China is presenting a much bigger threat, and Russia.
Well,
yes, yeah, please.
No, I mean, one of the issues is that that's just interesting is when it comes to demography, the fact that so many Russian women are marrying Chinese men in Siberia. The reason why this becomes so, and simply they're doing it because Chinese men drink less, and beat them less. And Russian blogs newspapers have talked about this and so forth. But the reason why this is important is simply because the precedent which Vladimir Putin cited for the invasion of the Crimea can ultimately be turned on him to be used to support Chinese claims further into Siberia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Russia is going to be a very interesting factor, I guess, between US and India also. But I just feel that somehow there can be better ways of, I would say, using or employing India's ties with Russia, just to manage Russia. Okay. Yes. And now,
Yeah.
so I'll just, we have many participants today. So if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to send your questions to me in the chat box. I guess I already have some questions, and I'll just read out some of them to you. Yes. US policy of pushing Iran to the limit has brought China-Iran closer. This is a dangerous relationship. Shouldn't be the cause of concern for USA and the world. I guess you've already answered a large part of it, but still, would you like to say something to the question?
I'll just say that Iran has a long pattern of looking at third powers in order to escape what they feel unfair pressure from existing powers. They turned to the Austro-Hungarians in the 1850s. They turned to the Belgians in the first decade of the 20th century. They turned to the Americans in the second decade of the 20th century. And every time they've done this, they've ended up feeling that those third powers have ultimately undermined them, and it's left a bitter taste in their mouth. This has led this has led Iranians to very much become xenophobic and distrustful of outside powers. The fact that China is talking about all these commercial agreements, which again haven't actually been announced, that would put them in direct competition with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is one of the reasons why I suspect that the Chinese-Iranian relationship isn't going to end well. And at a core level, the Iranians are going to remain very, very distrustful of it. So I see this as much more symbolic than real.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope it comes true, because, but given our experience in Pakistan, China has got very heavily into their internal system. They have almost bought the country. Now they said that we are going to buy Pakistan, and all the generals are with them. Hopefully, let's see how it goes. So we have one more question. Do you think the USA, the American attitude towards India vis-a-vis, first, critical raw material for vaccine, USS John Paul Jones entry in India's, yes. Second, the US aircraft carriers entry in India's exclusive economic zone. And third one, the US CIR recommendation to blacklist India and putting India in the priority watch list. Yeah, so some of this question, I guess, it particularly relates to the nuances of India-US relations, because we see lots of these ups and downs. So,
yeah. Well, first of all, when it comes to critical raw material with the vaccine, I condemn what Ned Price said. And certainly Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has reversed that. I'll chalk this, even though it was an own goal on the part of the United States, I chalk this up to the Biden administration being new and hitting the ground running. And in the end, they did the right thing. When it comes to the USS John Paul Jones entry into Indian exclusive economic zone, I'm really not up on this issue, so I'm going to defer that. We can talk about that at a future time. A U.S. Committee on International Religious Freedom recommendation to blacklist India. Ultimately, the opponents of India and some of the opponents of some recent discussions have their inroads in the United States. That said, the Indian American community has become increasingly politically powerful and can lobby on its own if only they would lobby with one voice. But ultimately, the fact that where I regret is that this oftentimes is fodder to those who are at a core level distrustful of the U.S. relationship. But it does it does provide, I mean, the fact is, if these are the most serious issues that are confronting us, this is, I mean, far different than the serious issues which were confronting us 10 or 20 years ago. And therefore, we still have a lot to do to advance the U.S.-India partnership, but I wouldn't want minor hurdles, minor impediments to become, let me put it this way, I wouldn't make mountains out of molehills. Let's address these rather than make these excuses to stop the development of our relationship.
I couldn't agree with this. I mean, they're absolutely right. This is because I just have some, I mean, few observations on these issues. I think some of them I mentioned in my article too. So I feel that U.S.-India partnership is really, it's getting stronger, you know, with the passage of time. But you know, in the public perception, like on social media, on various, you know, Facebook groups and Twitter groups, okay, there is a feeling that you know, government to government level cooperation coordination is absolutely great, but you know, especially the US media, the human rights organizations, you know, they are not doing complete justice to India, right? And when it comes to the New York Times stories on India, maybe like on the foreign affairs story, or even some of the national security portals of US writing on Indian affairs, you know, there is a feeling that they're not able to make an outreach, or you know, just to know what's happening on the other side of the spectrum. For example, I just like Israel, India-Israel partnership also started, formally it started in 1992, and after that, I mean, after the Modi government came into power, it became stronger. So in the public perception, Israel holds a very good impression. Okay? And people feel that yes, India-Israel relationship is going. But when it comes to US, we sometimes feel that Khalistani terrorist groups are making a very strong voice in America. Then some of the Islamist groups, you know, they're just feeding complete negative information about the human rights situation in India, whereas the reality is completely different. For example, there's this group called Popular Front of India. It's an Islamic extremist group in Kerala, and they have indulged into innumerable number of atrocities, some of which includes like chopping off the hands and legs of a professor for teaching about Prophet Muhammad in the class. He was a Christian professor. And this group has ties with some of the Islamist groups working in Washington, D.C., and they are able to influence UNSCR, this United States Committee for the Religious Freedom. So these are just some minor issues and hurdles, which I think the US media, or you know, the civil society organizations, I mean, they can have a look. We really need to address them. That's what you said. I would just agree with you on that. Yeah. Yes. And so some more questions. Yeah. Assuming the US will hedge their bets on the Afghan National Armed Forces post-withdrawal, the logistics of assuring material support to the ANF will need supply lines via Pakistan or Iran, which will make resolution of JCPOA important. How will the US resolve that dilemma?
I mean, the problem is, this is the problem right now. The US has a tremendous ability to believe its own spin. That we can convince ourselves, and the media will accept whatever the Biden spin is, that we don't fully see the ramifications of what we're doing. The fact of the matter is the Afghan National Security Forces don't have the they can fight, but they don't have the logistical ability to get to necessarily where the fight will be. They don't have an air force that can function independently. They don't have the medevac capability. And so it's one thing to demand people fight. It's another thing to demand people fight if they know that they're not going to be evacuated to a field hospital and get competent treatment. And so ultimately, these are the problems which the United States simply at this point just doesn't want to discuss. We have decided to abandon the fight. We will convince ourselves that we've done our part. In effect, it's a tremendous loss. And I'm sorry, the idiocy of ending this on September 11th. It's not just that someone in the administration is wrong. It signifies that, let's say, 24 officials, all surrounding President Biden, didn't have the wherewithal to get up and tell him this is a really bad idea.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Doctor. So, with one more question, I guess you have already answered a large part of it, but still, I'm just reading out the question if you have anything more to say. Isn't US policy leading to a creation of new bloc, that is Russia, China, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, the rogue
Um,
regimes?
Perhaps to some extent, yes, but I would argue that these countries have agency and they're not necessarily being driven into this partnership by the United States. And certainly, would the United States being much more effusive and towards Turkey or towards Pakistan change their position? I would argue no. That sometimes that antagonism towards the United States is just ingrained in their leader, and you can't change Imran Khan or the ISI. You can't change Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And at some point, rather than appeasing, you've got to stand up. I would also, if I may, address the ambassador's concern because I will need to end the call promptly at 10. My time. With that, he says we have a different story for Pakistani women married to Chinese. Isn't this somewhat facile? I would say no. First of all, if you look at the Russian sources on this, if you look at Russian blogs and reporting from Siberia, people talk about this. Second of all, since the independence of Armenia, Armenia lost 1/3 of its population to emigration to Russia to replace the Russians, which are no longer in the industrial towns in Siberia. So you've got a serious demographic problem inside Russia, and this is just part and parcel of it. Can you get good information that isn't simply anecdotal? The answer is no, because of the nature of Russia's dictatorial regime. But that doesn't mean that you can't look at the indications. And I should say that there's also a pattern here in the past in which Russian women disproportionately married Jewish men for the same reason before the Jews emigrated from Russia. There was actually an interesting question, if I may, on my thoughts about whether the east coast of the United Arab Emirates with its ports in Fujairah and Khor Fakkan are going to be targeted and used as a pressure point against the UAE by the IRGC. And the answer is they already have. This is one of the reasons why the United Arab Emirates called off the military operations in Hudaydah in Yemen, because as they were gearing up for the operation in Hudaydah, that's when their ships were hit, and that's when the limpet mine incidents happened in Khor Fakkan and Fujairah, and therefore the Emiratis understood that this was an Iranian red line and pushed back considerably.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. So I guess we have more or less come to the end of today's session. But just one in a lighter vein, for our India's IR enthusiasts, you also served as a political advisor to the coalition provisional government in Iraq. Would you like to share some of those experiences with our participants?
That would take a long time. I had a unique position. I had a unique position because I lived in the red zone. The problem with the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, is you were either based in Baghdad or you were based in the provinces stovepiping to Baghdad, but no one was making comparisons outside the out in the red zone about whether the reporting was true and what was going on in different provinces comparatively. And so that was my role. And I really just got to roam the country for 7 months living on my own. It was an ideal situation to learn about society.
Wonderful. Thank you. I guess we'll need one more session to to learn about your experiences in Iraq. Yeah. So sometime sooner in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So I think with this we come to the end of our session, and I would request Ambassador Trigunath, would you like to give some closing remarks?
Thank you, Abhinav. It was an amazing discussion. I mean, unfortunately, I missed the early part of it because of a TV interview. But Michael has amazing insights, and I fully agree with most of his observations. But of course, as far as withdrawal, I mean, I have seen the two things, and he has been in Iraq, and possibly he might disagree, but I have always considered that the worst and the most unthoughtful action on the part of the US has been invasion of Iraq, which has caused the destabilization in the Middle East, and we are seeing a lot of problems ever since. But then past is past. Now one more thing I would like to say, despite the basic differences, I think we need to mull and probably discuss once again, is that if there is somehow a possibility of a modus vivendi between Russia and the US. Of course, under Biden administration, it is very unlikely. Under Trump administration, there was a possibility. So I hope that could have happened. That could take care of large number of problems globally. Thank you once again, Michael. It was amazing, and we really enjoyed discussing, listening to you. Thank you. Thank you, Abhinav.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll just say goodbye to all of you. You can read Dr. Michael's commentaries and articles in National Interest and 1945. No, I mean, he gives amazing insights on the national security issues pertaining to US West Asia. So with this, goodbye. And I would like to thank NewsX, our partner in today's event, and soon we'll be uploading the recording. Thank you so much.